The scent of damp wool and old grievances clung to the air in the Smolny Institute's drafty scriptorium. Anya Valeriana, barely 20 but with eyes that held the weariness of ages, traced the faded Cyrillic script of a newly unearthed chronicle. And the Boyar Vasily, seeing the Tsar's weakness, did seize the moment, for power abhors a vacuum as nature abhors its opposite. A faint smile, sharp as a shard of ice, touched her lips. St. Petersburg, in this waning winter of 1788, was a city of whispers and shadows, a place where the grandeur of Catherine's court barely concealed the festering discontent in the frozen alleys and amongst the restless nobility. Anya was an anomaly. Daughter of a minor, scholarly noble family from the Novgorod gubernia, her intellect was her dowry. Her ambition a carefully guarded flame. Unlike the other young ladies at Smolny, groomed for advantageous marriages, Anya devoured history, philosophy, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, their smuggled texts hidden beneath her thin mattress. She saw in Catherine a paradox, the German-born empress who spoke of enlightenment yet ruled with an iron fist, who corresponded with philosophers yet tightened the shackles of serfdom. After Pugachev's ghost still haunted the countryside, Anya's world was small, bounded by Smolny's cold walls and the occasional, supervised outing. But her mind roamed free, fueled by the radical notion that Russia, this vast, slumbering giant, could be awakened not just by imperial decree, but by reasoned reform, by a system that valued merit over birth, justice over patronage. A subtle, almost invisible scar, a thin white line above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall in her father's cluttered library, throbbed faintly whenever she felt the familiar surge of frustration at the state of things. It was her private reminder, even a small stumble could leave a permanent mark. Or, perhaps, be a catalyst. Her current focus was a series of anonymous pamphlets, the Rus Resurgent, that had begun to circulate amongst the city's more liberal-minded students and junior officers. They were brilliantly argued, calling for a new Zemsky Sabor, a true assembly of the land, for limitations on autocratic power, for the education of the serfs. They echoed her own fiercely held beliefs. And she felt a dangerous kinship with their unknown author. Valeriana, a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. It was Matron Orlova, a woman whose stern demeanor was a fortress around a surprisingly keen, if conservative, mind. Counselor Vorontsov is here. He wishes to speak with you. Anya's heart gave a small, uncomfortable lurch. Count Alexei Vorontsov was a man of considerable influence. An older statesman known for his shrewd political mind and his somewhat ambiguous position within Catherine's inner circle, neither a fawning favorite nor an open critic. But a man who navigated the treacherous currents with unnerving skill. He had taken a cursory interest in the Smolny's brightest, occasionally sponsoring a promising girl. Anya had met him twice, brief, formal encounters. Why would he seek her out now? She smoothed the dark wool of her uniform dress, its severe cut doing little to hide the intensity in her gaze. Her dark hair, usually braided for practicality, felt suddenly untidy. She followed Matron Orlova to a small, rarely used reception room. Vorontsov was standing by the window, looking out at the frozen Neva. He was tall, his shoulders slightly stooped, not from age but from the weight of secrets. Anya thought. He turned as she entered, his eyes, gray and piercing, assessing her. Anna Petrovna, he said, his voice a low rumble. You have a keen mind, I am told. Your essays on Montesquieu show an unusual grasp. Anya inclined her head. You are kind, Your Excellency. Kindness has little currency in our St. Petersburg, child, Vorontsov said, a dry smile playing on his lips. He gestured to a folio on the table. These Resurgent pamphlets. Have you read them? Anya's breath caught. She kept her expression carefully neutral. I have heard of them, Excellency. They are much discussed. Indeed. Vorontsov's gaze sharpened. They argue for a more enlightened path for Russia, a path that some might find disruptive. He paused, letting the silence stretch. The author shows a rather profound understanding of both our history and certain Western philosophies. Much like your essays, in fact. Anya's mind raced. Was this an accusation, a test? She met his gaze directly. The desire for a better Russia is not unique, Excellency. Many hearts hold such a hope. Vorontsov's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. Hope is a dangerous commodity, Anna Petrovna. Especially when it finds a voice as eloquent as this. He tapped the folio. Her Majesty is displeased by such anonymous dissent. She seeks its source. This was it. The precipice. Anya felt the old scar throb. She could dissemble, feign ignorance. And if the source were found? Excellency, she asked, her voice steady. What then? Vorontsov studied her for a long moment. That would depend, child, on whether the source was merely a reckless idealist. Or someone who could be guided. Someone who understands that true change is not forged in fiery pamphlets alone, but in the patient, often compromised, art of the possible. He took a step closer. I am not seeking to expose an author for the Empress's displeasure, Anna Petrovna. I am seeking potential. Tell me, if you were to advise Her Majesty, if you truly had her ear, what is the first, most practical step you would suggest to begin this resurgence you so clearly admire? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. This was no idle query. This was an invitation, cloaked in a threat, or perhaps a genuine offer from a man weary of the old games. Anya knew her answer could set her on a path from which there was no return, a path that led either to influence or to a very cold, very distant exile. The whispers of the court. The weight of Catherine's long reign, the desperate hope for a different Russia, it all converged in this small, cold room. She thought of the serfs on her family's modest estate. Of the bright, wasted minds she saw even within Smolny, of the suffocating grip of patronage and corruption. Excellency, Anya began, her voice low but firm, the carefully chosen words of her anonymous pamphlets now ready to be spoken aloud. To be owned. The first step is not a decree, but an inquiry. A commission, not of the usual grandees, but of practical minds from varied estates, to assess the true state of the peasantry. Not through the rose-tinted reports of provincial governors, but through direct testimony. Knowledge, sir, true knowledge, must precede reform. Even the Empress, for all her correspondence with M. Voltaire, acts upon information that is often curated to please her. Vorontsov's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, respect, amusement, crossed his eyes. A bold proposal, Anna Petrovna. One that would displease many who benefit from the current curation. He paused. You understand the risks of such bold thoughts, should they be traced to their true author. Anya straightened, the image of Catherine, the German princess who seized an empire, flashing in her mind. If Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst could become Catherine the Great, then perhaps Anya Valeriana of Novgorod could, at the very least, try to speak truth to power. Even if it was through the careful mediation of a man like Vorontsov. Risks, Excellency, are inherent in any endeavor worth pursuing. The greater risk, I believe, is in silence, in allowing Russia to drift further into stagnation while mouthing pieties about enlightenment. The old statesman was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. The scar above Anya's eyebrow seemed to burn. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. You have courage, child. And a dangerous intellect, perhaps. Perhaps there is a place for such qualities, even in St. Petersburg. He picked up his hat. I will consider your hypothetical advice. Be discreet, Anna Petrovna. The walls of Smolny are not as thick as some believe. With that, he was gone, leaving Anya alone with the echoing silence and the weight of her unspoken authorship. The game, she realized, had begun. Anya's life at Smolny shifted subtly after Vorontsov's visit. Matron Orlova treated her with a new, almost wary deference. Whispers followed her, no longer just about her scholarly intensity, but tinged with a nascent curiosity. Vorontsov did not contact her directly for several weeks, a silence that Anya found more unnerving than any overt action. She threw herself into her studies, her mind a whirlwind of political theory and historical precedent, half expecting a summons to the Tsaritsyn's private chambers, or worse, a quiet removal to some provincial obscurity. Then, a small, unsigned note appeared among her books: the ice on the Neva thins. Prudence is advised when testing its strength. Observe the patterns of the current before stepping forth. A well-wisher. Anya knew it was from Vorontsov. The message was clear: caution, observation, patience. He was not going to catapult her into the limelight, nor was he abandoning her. He was testing her, perhaps grooming her. Spring arrived, painting St. Petersburg in hesitant pastels. With it came news that rippled through the court. Her Majesty was indeed considering a new commission to study agricultural conditions, though its scope and membership were subjects of fierce debate among her advisers. Anya felt a thrill of trepidation. Had her words, filtered through Vorontsov, planted a seed, her graduation from Smolny was a quiet affair. Unlike many of her peers, who were immediately swept into the marriage market or appointed as ladies-in-waiting to minor German princesses, Anya received a peculiar offer, facilitated, she was certain, by Vorontsov, a junior position as a cataloguer and research assistant in the Imperial Library. Under the directorship of the aging, apolitical scholar, Pyotr Sokolov. It was an unglamorous post, far from the glittering heart of the court, yet it offered something far more valuable to Anya: access. Access to books. To documents, to the quiet currents of information that flowed beneath the surface of official pronouncements. The Imperial Library was a labyrinth of towering shelves and dusty silence. A haven for Anya. Sokolov, a kindly man more interested in deciphering ancient Greek manuscripts than in court politics, largely left her to her own devices. Anya used her time judiciously. She devoured records of past reforms, studied Catherine's own early writings, the nakaz, and compared its lofty ideals with the grim realities detailed in provincial reports she unearthed from neglected archives. She was building her arsenal of knowledge, piece by piece. Vorontsov began to summon her. Infrequently at first, to his grand, dimly lit house on the Fontanka. These were not social calls. He would pose complex questions about Russian law, about historical precedents for land ownership, about the economic theories of the physiocrats. He listened intently to her answers, his gray eyes missing nothing, occasionally offering a cryptic comment or a piece of seemingly irrelevant court gossip that Anya would later realize was a crucial piece of a larger puzzle. He was teaching her to think politically, to see the interconnectedness of ideas and interests. Power, Anna Petrovna, he told her one evening, swirling the brandy in his glass, is not a scepter to be brandished. It is a web, delicate and immensely strong. Each thread is an interest, a loyalty, a fear. To rule, one must understand the web. Know where to pluck, where to reinforce, and where, if necessary, to sever. It was during these sessions that Anya began to encounter another figure who moved in Vorontsov's orbit, Captain Dmitry Rostinov of the Preobrazhensky Regiment. Rostinov was everything Anya was not: charismatic, overtly ambitious, a man of action rather than a scholar. He was handsome in a rugged, military way, with a quick smile and an even quicker mind for strategy. He was fiercely loyal to Catherine, yet he was also a pragmatist, aware of the deep-seated issues plaguing the army and the empire. Rostinov was initially dismissive of Anya, this bookish girl Vorontsov seemed to favor. But during one heated discussion about military supply lines, Anya, drawing on her research into Peter the Great's campaigns, offered a solution so innovative and well-reasoned that Rostinov was visibly taken aback. A grudging respect began to form between them, an unlikely alliance of pen and sword. Rostinov had the ear of certain military factions. Anya had the intellectual firepower. Vorontsov, Anya suspected, was orchestrating this connection with a deliberate hand. Meanwhile, the political climate in St. Petersburg grew more tense. Catherine, aging and perhaps weary, was increasingly surrounded by conservative advisers who viewed any talk of reform with suspicion, especially with the unsettling news of revolution brewing in France. The Empress's son, the Grand Duke Paul, a volatile and unpredictable figure, was a constant source of anxiety. His open disdain for his mother's liberal affectations making him a rallying point for reactionary elements. One of these leading conservative figures was Count Kirill Bezborodko. A man of immense wealth and influence, a staunch defender of noble privileges and the existing order. Bezborodko saw the proposed agricultural commission as a dangerous precedent, a potential crack in the edifice of autocracy and serfdom. He began to actively work against it, using his vast network of contacts to sow doubts in the Empress's mind. Anya, through her library access, stumbled upon correspondence that hinted at Bezborodko's less savory dealings. Land grabs, illicit trade monopolies, and the brutal exploitation of serfs on his vast estates, far exceeding even the harsh norms of the time. She brought this information to Vorontsov. "This is dangerous knowledge, Anna Petrovna," Vorontsov said, his face grave. "Bezborodko is not a man to be trifled with. He has destroyed careers, and lives, for far less." "But if the Empress knew?" Anya began. "Her Majesty knows what she chooses to know." Vorontsov interrupted, his voice sharp. "And she chooses to know things that maintain the balance she requires. Bezborodko, for all his faults, commands significant loyalty among the old nobility. To move against him directly is a high-stakes gamble." He looked at her intently. "However, information, like a carefully placed stone, can start an avalanche if the conditions are right." Anya understood. A direct accusation would be dismissed, and she would be crushed. But if the information could be leaked, anonymously, to the right circles, perhaps to rival nobles, or even to foreign diplomats whose reports might find their way back to the Empress through less filtered channels. It was a perilous game of whispers and shadows, the kind that Catherine herself had mastered in her rise to power. Anya felt a cold knot of fear, but also a surge of exhilaration. She was no longer merely an observer, a scholar. She was becoming a player, guided by Vorontsov's experienced hand, with Rostinov as a potential, if unpredictable, piece on the board. The lessons of Montesquieu were one thing. The realities of St. Petersburg politics were quite another. She was learning that the path to an enlightened Russia was paved not just with lofty ideals, but with cunning, courage, and a willingness to navigate the murky depths of human ambition. The scar above her eye throbbed again, a familiar companion on this uncertain journey. The Commission on Agricultural Conditions was eventually formed, but it was a shadow of what Anya had envisioned and Vorontsov had subtly pushed for. Stacked with Bezborodko's allies and landowners with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, its mandate was diluted, its investigations superficial. Anya felt a familiar sting of disappointment, a harsh lesson in the inertia of power. "Patience, Anna Petrovna," Vorontsov counseled during one of their clandestine meetings. His study, filled with the scent of old leather and imported tobacco, felt like the only sane place in St. Petersburg. A direct assault on a fortress rarely succeeds. One must find the cracks, widen them slowly. Bezborodko believes he has won this round. Let him believe it. Arrogance is a powerful ally. For his opponents. Anya, however, found patience a difficult virtue. The information she possessed about Bezborodko's excesses burned in her mind. She began, meticulously and with extreme caution, to compile a dossier, cross-referencing her findings with shipping manifests from the port, land registry archives, and even carefully worded inquiries to contacts her father. The quiet Novgorod scholar, still maintained in provincial administrations. She worked late into the night in the Imperial Library, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the intrigues of the court. It was during this period that her interactions with Dmitry Rostinov became more frequent. He would often find her in the library, ostensibly to consult historical military texts. But their conversations invariably veered towards the current state of the empire. Rostinov, for all his outward confidence, was deeply troubled by the army's inefficiencies, the corruption that siphoned off supplies, and the low morale among the common soldiers. Many of them serfs treated little better than beasts of burden. "Your books and theories are well and good, Valeriana," he said one afternoon, gesturing dismissively at a stack of Enlightenment treatises, "but how do they feed a soldier freezing on the Finnish border? How do they stop a quartermaster from selling off gunpowder for personal profit? They offer a framework, Captain," Anya retorted, her eyes flashing. "A way to diagnose the sickness. Not just treat the symptoms. If soldiers are not valued, if merit is not rewarded, if supply lines are managed by corrupt appointees rather than competent officers, then no amount of brute force will secure our borders or our future." Their debates were often sharp, yet an undercurrent of mutual intellectual respect, even fascination, grew. Rostinov was impressed by her grasp of logistics and her fearless critiques of systemic flaws. Anya, in turn, began to appreciate his practical insights, his understanding of how power actually operated within the military hierarchy, a world far removed from her scholarly pursuits. They were, in many ways, two sides of the same coin, both patriots, both reformers in their own spheres, though their methods and temperaments differed vastly. Vorontsov observed this budding, if prickly, alliance with quiet satisfaction. He knew that intellectual firepower alone was insufficient. To effect real change, one needed access to the levers of hard power, and in Catherine's Russia, the military was a paramount lever. The opportunity to use Anya's dossier on Bezborodko came unexpectedly. A border skirmish with the Ottoman Turks in the south escalated, requiring a significant deployment of troops and resources. Bezborodko, as head of a key committee overseeing military appropriations, pushed for costly, ill-conceived measures that seemed designed more to enrich his associates than to effectively support the war effort. Rostinov, recently promoted to major for his competence in an earlier campaign, was privately furious, seeing firsthand how Bezborodko's policies were hamstringing the army. "He is bleeding us dry before a single shot is fired in earnest," Rostinov fumed to Anya and Vorontsov, during a secret meeting at Vorontsov's dacha outside the city. The scent of pine and damp earth was a welcome change from St. Petersburg's oppressive air. "And now, perhaps," Vorontsov said, his gaze resting on Anya, "is the time for that carefully placed stone." Anya understood. With the Empress's attention focused on the war, and with Bezborodko making himself vulnerable through his wartime profiteering, the moment was ripe. But a direct presentation to Catherine was still too risky. Instead, Vorontsov devised a more intricate plan. Portions of Anya's research, carefully anonymized and focused, specifically on Bezborodko's mishandling of war contracts and his connections to suspect merchants, were leaked to two key individuals. The first was Count Panin, a respected elder statesman and a long-standing, albeit cautious, rival of Bezborodko, known for his probity. The second, more audaciously, was through a channel Rostinov cultivated, a junior aide to Prince Potemkin, Catherine's powerful, if aging, favorite and the chief architect of her southern expansionist policies. Potemkin, though often at odds with other factions, had little tolerance for corruption that directly threatened his military projects. The effect was not immediate, but subtle shifts began to occur. Panin raised pointed questions in the State Council. Potemkin, from his headquarters in the south, sent a sharply worded private dispatch to the Empress, complaining of impediments and peculation in St. Petersburg that were affecting the war effort. Catherine, sensitive to any threat to her beloved southern strategy and to Potemkin's influence, began to listen. Bezborodko, initially contemptuous of the rumors, soon found himself on the defensive. His usual bluster and network of allies were not enough to shield him from the combined, if uncoordinated, pressure from Panin's quiet disapproval and Potemkin's powerful displeasure. He made missteps, became more openly aggressive, which only served to alienate wavering figures in the court. Anya watched these developments from the periphery, a knot of anxiety and anticipation in her stomach. She saw the power of information, the way carefully curated truths could become weapons in the shadowy battles of the court. She also saw the moral ambiguity of it all. She was using Bezborodko's genuine corruption against him, but the methods were indirect, manipulative, the very tactics she decried in others. "It is the nature of the game," Anna Petrovna, Vorontsov told her, sensing her unease. "One cannot cleanse a Augean stable with rosewater. Sometimes, one must use the tools the system provides, even if they are imperfect." The culmination came during a tense session of the State Council. Catherine, her face an impassive mask, listened as Bezborodko attempted to defend his recent decisions regarding war supplies. Then, Count Panin, armed with the carefully leaked information, its true source unknown to him, he believed it came from a disgruntled clerk in Bezborodko's own ministry, calmly and methodically dismantled Bezborodko's arguments, exposing inconsistencies and hinting at gross mismanagement. Potemkin's critical dispatch was then, by coincidence, formally read into the record. Catherine did not act immediately, she was too skilled a politician for that. But the seeds of doubt were sown. Bezborodko's influence began to wane. Committees he chaired were quietly restructured. His access to the Empress became less frequent. It was not a dramatic fall, but a slow, inexorable erosion of power, orchestrated from the shadows. Anya felt no triumph. Only a grim satisfaction and a growing awareness of the burdens that came with such maneuvers. She had helped to weaken a corrupt and powerful man, but she had also stepped further into the labyrinth of court politics, a place where ideals were often casualties. Rostinov, however, was more direct in his approval. "You have a sharper sword than any in this city, Valeriana," he told her, a rare note of unreserved admiration in his voice. "Even if it is only made of paper and ink." Their alliance, born of shared frustration and Vorontsov's machinations, was solidifying. Anya began to realize that Vorontsov was not just mentoring her. He was building a faction. A small, carefully chosen group of individuals who, like him, believed Russia needed a new direction, and who possessed the diverse skills, intellectual, military, political, to perhaps, just perhaps, nudge it onto that path. The question was, where would that path ultimately lead, and what would be the cost of treading it? The Empress was old, Grand Duke Paul was a looming shadow, and the winds of change from France were growing stronger, carrying the scent of revolution and the fall of kings. St. Petersburg was a city on edge, and Anya Valeriana was now undeniably part of its intricate, dangerous dance. The ensuing years were a masterclass in patience and precision for Anya. Under Vorontsov's tutelage, she learned the subtle art of influence, the carefully worded memorandum that could sway a key official, the discreet cultivation of contacts within the burgeoning bureaucracy, the importance of knowing not just what was said in council, but what was whispered in salons and barracks. Bezborodko's decline had created a power vacuum. And while no single faction immediately filled it, the political landscape was subtly realigning. Anya's official position in the Imperial Library remained her public face, a cloak of scholarly obscurity. But her unofficial role as Vorontsov's intellectual right hand grew. She drafted policy papers that he would then adapt and present as his own or subtly feed to other, more prominent figures. She analyzed foreign dispatches, summarized economic treatises, and even ghost-wrote speeches for allies less adept with the pen. It was thankless work in one sense, her name never publicly attached to these influential documents. But Anya understood the strategy. Vorontsov was protecting her, allowing her to gain experience and influence without exposing her to the full force of courtly jealousy and intrigue until she was ready. Her relationship with Dmitry Rostonov deepened into a complex, often unspoken, partnership. They met regularly, sometimes at Vorontsov's, sometimes in less conspicuous locations, a quiet corner of the summer garden, a bustling book market near Gostiny Dvor. Anya provided Rostonov with intelligence gleaned from her research and contacts, insights into factional alignments, early warnings of policy shifts that might affect the military. Rostonov, in turn, offered her a window into the world of the Guards regiments, the mood among the officers, the practical challenges of implementing imperial decrees on the ground. He also provided a measure of protection. It became known in certain circles that Major Rostonov held the library girl in some esteem, a fact that discouraged minor harassments or obstructions. There was an undeniable current between them, a spark of something more than strategic alliance. Anya, fiercely disciplined and emotionally guarded, found herself drawn to Rostonov's blunt honesty and passionate commitment to his soldiers. He, in turn, was increasingly captivated by her intellect, her quiet courage, and the fire he glimpsed beneath her composed exterior. But neither acknowledged it. The stakes were too high, their focus too intent on the larger game. A personal entanglement could be a fatal weakness. The unrest in France cast a long, dark shadow over St. Petersburg. Catherine, once a correspondent of Voltaire and Diderot, now viewed the revolution with horror and suspicion. Censorship tightened. Talk of reform, once fashionable, became dangerous. The Empress grew more reliant on conservative voices, and Grand Duke Paul, with his Prussianesque obsession with discipline and autocratic power, seemed to gain a more attentive, if still wary, audience. This was the new crisis Anya, Vorontsov, and Rostonov had to navigate, how to advocate for necessary changes in an atmosphere of reactionary fear. Vorontsov argued for extreme caution, for working within the existing structures, however flawed. Rostonov grew impatient, seeing the empire's weaknesses becoming more glaring. Anya found herself torn. Her intellect understood Vorontsov's pragmatism, but her heart ached for the bolder reforms she had once dreamed of. "We are becoming like them, Alexei Ilyich," she said to Vorontsov one evening, the frustration evident in her voice. Whispering in shadows, content with incremental gains while the foundations rot. What happened to the resurgence? Vorontsov sighed, the lines on his face deeper than usual. The resurgence, Anna Petrovna, must survive the winter. And the harsh winter is upon us. Her Majesty sees Jacobins behind every critique. Prince Paul sees an opportunity to impose his iron will. To be bold now is to be broken. But the foundations were indeed rotting. A series of disastrous harvests in the southern gubernias, coupled with rapacious taxation to fund ongoing, low-level conflicts and Catherine's ever-expanding court, led to widespread peasant distress. This was not a Pugachev-scale rebellion, not yet, but the countryside seethed with discontent. Reports reaching St. Petersburg, even the heavily censored ones, spoke of local uprisings. Of serfs refusing to work, of desperate pleas for relief. This was the lower district crisis of their current reality, a slow burn rather than a sudden conflagration. Varus, in the original conception of Anya's imagined Ethelberg, had advocated for a brutal crackdown. In Catherine's Russia, the response from the dominant conservative faction, now ascendant, was a mixture of denial, calls for increased repression, and a blame campaign against outside agitators or insufficiently pious peasants. Anya, using her access to provincial reports in the library, compiled a detailed, harrowing account of the true scale of the suffering and the potential for wider revolt. It was far grimmer than the official summaries reaching the Empress. She presented it to Vorontsov and Rostinov. Rostinov was grim. "If this continues, we won't need the French to bring chaos. We will breed it ourselves. My men are already stretched thin maintaining order in the garrison towns. If the villages explode." He left the sentence unfinished. Vorontsov, for once, seemed at a loss to present this directly to Her Majesty. In her current mood, she would see it as an attack, as fear-mongering. She might even suspect us of fomenting the very unrest we warn against. It was Anya who proposed the desperate, dangerous gambit. "Then we do not present it as a warning from us," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We ensure it reaches her through a channel she trusts, or at least one she cannot easily dismiss as self-serving." She looked at Rostinov. "Prince Potemkin is still influential, especially regarding the south. He has his own sources of information. If he could be made to see that this unrest threatens the stability of the very lands he conquered for her, the grain supplies for his armies." Rostinov was skeptical. "Potemkin is a law unto himself. And he is old, ailing. His ear is not so easily gained. But his pride in his achievements for Russia is immense," Anya countered, "and his network, though perhaps diminished, still functions. If a clear, factual report, detailing how this peasant distress undermines Russia's strength in the south, could reach one of his trusted lieutenants." Vorontsov saw the audacity, the sheer risk. Potemkin was notoriously unpredictable. But he also saw the potential. It would have to be flawless. Anna Petrovna. Untraceable to us. And it would have to appeal not to his sentiment, but to his strategic sense and his ego. Over the next few weeks, Anya worked feverishly, aided by Rostinov's knowledge of military logistics and supply needs in the southern territories. She crafted a document that was not a plea for mercy, but a cold, hard analysis of how famine and unrest were crippling the economic and military potential of new Russia. She included maps, figures on grain shortages, reports of troop deployments being diverted to quell local disturbances instead of reinforcing the frontiers. She carefully omitted any direct criticism of Catherine's policies, instead framing the crisis as a result of local mismanagement and inefficient implementation that threatened the Empress's grand vision. The most dangerous part was dissemination. Rostinov, through a former subordinate now serving in Potemkin's vast, sprawling household in Ukraine, arranged for the report to be discovered among dispatches from a supposedly reliable local official known for his bluntness. It was a multi-layered deception, each step fraught with peril. They waited. Weeks turned into a month. St. Petersburg buzzed with news of French revolutionary victories, of Catherine's increasingly harsh edicts against any form of dissent. Anya felt the walls closing in, the fear that their gamble had failed, or worse, been discovered. Then, word came, not through official channels, but through the city's ever-active rumor mill. Prince Potemkin, from his sickbed in Jassy, had sent a series of urgent, almost frantic, letters to the Empress. The content was secret, but the tone was reportedly alarming. Soon after, Catherine, looking grimmer and more careworn than usual, summoned a special council. New measures were announced, a temporary suspension of certain grain requisitions in the hardest-hit southern provinces, the dispatch of imperial commissioners not Bezborodko's cronies this time, but men known for their efficiency, some even with vaguely reformist leanings, and a public proclamation denouncing local officials who exploited the peasantry. It was not systemic reform. It was not emancipation. But it was a response, a significant shift from the earlier denial and calls for pure repression. It was a small victory, wrested from the jaws of a growing crisis. Achieved through dangerous, indirect means. Anya allowed herself a moment of quiet relief, but it was short-lived. Vorontsov, his face etched with fatigue, delivered a sobering assessment. "We have bought time, Anna Petrovna, nothing more. And we have made ourselves more visible to those who watch for any shift in the currents of power. Her Majesty may have acted, but she will also wonder who so effectively illuminated the problem for Prince Potemkin. She does not like surprises, even beneficial ones." Rostinov, too, was pragmatic. "The relief measures will help, for now. But the underlying sickness remains. And men like Bezborodko, though diminished, are not toothless. They will seek the source of their discomfort." Anya looked at her two allies, two very different men bound to her by a shared, perilous vision. The path ahead was still shrouded in fog, but one thing was clear: they had successfully navigated a major crisis, not by direct confrontation, but by understanding and manipulating the intricate web of power that was Catherine's Russia. She had tasted the bitter fruit of compromise and the intoxicating hint of real influence. The Smolny girl who dreamed of a reformed Russia was slowly, painstakingly learning how such dreams might, with immense risk and unwavering resolve, be nudged towards reality. The price, she was beginning to understand, was a constant walk along a razor's edge. The fragile respite brought by the intervention in the southern provinces did little to ease the underlying tensions in St. Petersburg. Catherine, visibly aged and increasingly isolated by her own fears of revolutionary contagion, clung tighter to the reins of power, yet her grip felt less certain. Grand Duke Paul, her estranged son and heir, loomed larger, his coterie of dour, militaristic followers making no secret of their disdain for the excesses and foreign notions of his mother's reign. They promised a return to true Russian discipline, an iron order that sent shivers down the spines of those who remembered the darker days of previous reigns. Anya, Vorontsov, and Rostinov found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Their quiet successes had not gone unnoticed. Bezborodko, though his public influence was curtailed, still commanded a network of informants, his resentment a festering wound. He began to speak openly in conservative salons of a shadow cabal of Zapadnik and dreamers misleading the Empress and undermining the foundations of the empire. While no names were mentioned publicly, the implication was clear. "He is hunting, Anna Petrovna," Vorontsov warned, his voice heavy. "And he is not without allies who share his fears, or his ambitions to profit from our downfall." The pressure forced their small group to become even more discreet. Their meetings less frequent, their communications more guarded. Anya felt the suffocating weight of constant vigilance. Every unfamiliar face in the library, every unexpected summons, every whispered conversation overheard in a corridor, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. The thrill of intellectual combat was being replaced by the grim necessity of political survival. It was during this period of heightened tension that Celine Kirsonova re-entered Anya's orbit in a more significant way. Celine, a contemporary from Smolny, had navigated a different path. Daughter of a wealthy and influential merchant family with strong ties to the burgeoning industrial enterprises favored by some of Catherine's more forward-thinking economic advisors, Celine was pragmatic, ambitious, and possessed a network that complemented Anya's scholarly and Vorontsov's courtly connections. She was a creature of the salons, a gatherer of information, a subtle influencer. Celine had always maintained a wary but respectful distance from Anya. She admired Anya's intellect but was skeptical of her idealism. Now, however, Celine sought Anya out. "The winds are shifting, Valeriana," Celine said, her voice low, as they shared a rare cup of tea in a secluded alcove of a fashionable pâtisserie. The scent of expensive French perfume and an undercurrent of political intrigue filled the air. "Bezborodko is not the only one who feels threatened. Many who have prospered under Her Majesty's more expansive policies are concerned about what Prince Paul might bring." Anya listened intently. Celine's faction, the new money, the industrialists, the merchants who benefited from Catherine's expansion of trade and relatively for Russia stable governance, had much to lose from Paul's reactionary agenda. They see Paul as a return to arbitrary rule, to policies that favor the old landed aristocracy exclusively, to the disruption of the economic pathways your mother and her circle helped build. Anya observed. Celine nodded, a flicker of appreciation in her eyes for Anya's quick grasp. "Precisely. We are not idealists like you and Vorontsov, perhaps. Our motives are self-preservation, the protection of our enterprises, but in this, our interests may align." Celine leaned closer. "Bezborodko is trying to paint all reform, all modern thought, as a precursor to French terror. He is trying to consolidate the old guard around Prince Paul, offering himself as the strong hand that will guide the transition and crush dissent. If he succeeds, people like Vorontsov and you will be among the first to fall. And frankly, our enterprises will not be far behind." It was a blunt, pragmatic offer of alliance, born not of shared ideals but of shared threat. Anya, despite her innate caution, recognized its potential. Celine's network could provide early warnings, access to different circles of influence, and perhaps even financial resources if needed. "What do you propose, Kirsanova?" Anya asked. "Information, Valeriana. A pooling of resources. Bezborodko is not invincible. He has enemies, and his past is colorful." Celine's smile was sharp. "My people hear things in the counting houses and on the wharves that your scholars and Vorontsov's courtiers might miss. And you, I suspect, have access to archives that could illuminate certain historical transactions." Anya thought of her meticulously compiled dossier on Bezborodko, parts of which had already been used. But there was more, much more, and if such information were to surface, then perhaps, Celine said, her eyes gleaming, even Her Majesty, in her desire for stability above all, might see that Bezborodko and his agitations are more of a threat to that stability than the reasoned discourse of certain well-intentioned subjects. It was a dangerous game, using one enemy to discredit another, aligning with factions whose ultimate aims might diverge significantly from her own. But Vorontsov's words echoed in her mind, "One must use the tools the system provides." With Vorontsov's cautious approval, a fragile, undeclared alliance was formed. Anya and Celine began to discreetly share intelligence. Celine's network provided whispers of Bezborodko's clandestine meetings with Paul's hardline supporters, of his attempts to secure promises of future power. Anya, in turn, guided Celine's researchers toward specific periods in the archives, unearthing old land disputes and questionable state contracts that implicated Bezborodko or his closest allies in past corruptions far more extensive than previously revealed. Dmitry Rostinov was wary of Celine. "She is a viper, Anya," he warned. "She serves her own interests first and always. Don't trust her further than you can throw her." "I do not trust her, Dmitry," Anya replied calmly. But her interests, for now, align with ours. And her information is valuable. Her relationship with Rostinov had settled into a steady, reliable camaraderie, the unspoken emotional undercurrents carefully suppressed by both. He was her sounding board for practicalities, her link to the tangible power of the military, and, increasingly, a friend whose loyalty she did not doubt. Even if she could not fully articulate the depth of her reliance on him, the culmination of their efforts against Bezborodko was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, steady drip of damaging revelations, expertly timed and placed by Celine's salon contacts and Vorontsov's courtly maneuvers. An inconvenient old lawsuit resurfaced. A foreign trade deal Bezborodko had championed was exposed as hugely unfavorable to Russia, benefiting only a handful of his associates. Whispers of his secret assurances to Grand Duke Paul's faction reached Catherine's ears, not as direct accusations, but as concerns for the stability of the succession voiced by loyal subjects. Catherine, already suspicious of Paul and increasingly intolerant of any factionalism that threatened to destabilize her final years, began to distance herself further from Bezborodko. His pronouncements were ignored, his presence at key meetings became rare. He was not publicly disgraced, but he was effectively neutralized, a political ghost haunting the fringes of the court. It was a victory, of sorts. They had removed a dangerous opponent. But Anya felt a growing unease. The methods used, the alliances formed, were pulling her further away from the clear, idealistic principles that had first set her on this path. She was becoming adept at the very games she despised. "This is the price, Anna Petrovna," Vorontsov said, observing her troubled expression after a particularly complex piece of political maneuvering orchestrated with Celine's faction had borne fruit. To achieve great things, one must often wade through mud. The question is whether you can keep your eyes on the stars while doing so. But the stars seemed increasingly distant. The Empress was failing. Her health, a closely guarded secret, was visibly declining. The question of the succession, of Paul's ascent, was no longer a distant concern but an imminent reality. And Paul, it was widely known, had a long memory for those he perceived as his mothers. Creatures, or worse, as independent thinkers. The anonymous pamphlets, the Rus Resurgent, had long since ceased publication. The author, Anya Valeriana, was now too deeply enmeshed in the practical, perilous business of power to engage in such overt idealism. The scar above her eye, once a symbol of youthful resolve, now felt more like a brand, a mark of the compromises made, the innocence lost. The greatest test was yet to come. Not just surviving the transition of power, but somehow trying to shape it, to salvage something of her original vision from the wreckage of a dying reign and the dawn of an uncertain, potentially terrifying, new era. The final year of Catherine's reign was a study in gilded decay. The Empress, though her intellect remained sharp, was physically frail. Her public appearances became infrequent, her edicts often reflecting the influence of the most recent, or most forceful, advisor to gain her ear. St. Petersburg held its breath. Grand Duke Paul, no longer content to wait in the wings, began to assert himself more openly. His pronouncements on the necessity of discipline and the rollback of his mother's frivolous projects growing bolder, his shadow fell heavily over the court. For Anya, Vorontsov, and Rostinov, it was a time of acute danger. Bezborodko, though politically marginalized, was not entirely without influence, and his animosity towards them was a known quantity. More concerning were Paul's own favorites, a new constellation of ambitious, often ruthless men eager to settle scores and secure their positions in the coming regime. Anya's association with Vorontsov, a man who had served Catherine faithfully but was never part of Paul's inner circle, marked them both. Rostinov's known pragmatism and his quiet efforts to improve conditions for common soldiers were viewed with suspicion by Paul's hardline military adherents, who favored brutal discipline over morale. Celine Kirsonova, ever the pragmatist, began to subtly distance herself from Vorontsov's faction. Her family's commercial interests required a good relationship with whoever held power. While she continued to share an occasional piece of valuable information with Anya, a warning veiled in salon gossip, their active collaboration waned. One must trim one's sails to the prevailing wind, Valeriana, she remarked coolly during a chance encounter. Anya understood. It was the way of their world. Vorontsov, old and weary, seemed to be preparing for the inevitable. He spent more time at his country estate, putting his affairs in order. He urged Anya to be cautious, even to consider leaving St. Petersburg for a time. Paul will sweep clean, he warned her. And those who flourished, however modestly, under his mother, will be the first to feel the broom. And you? Alexei Ilyich, Anya asked, a knot of genuine affection and fear in her chest for this cynical, wise old man who had become her unlikely mentor. I am an old tree, Anna Petrovna, he said with a faint, sad smile. My roots are too deep in this soil. If I am to fall, I will fall here. He pressed a small, intricately carved ivory box into her hand. These are letters, contacts in various European capitals, Vienna, Berlin, even Paris. Though God knows what state that city is in. Scholars, merchants, a few discreet political figures. Should the worst happen, should you need to find a different air to breathe, they may be of assistance. Anya clutched the box. Her throat tight. The thought of exile was terrifying, a negation of everything she had worked for. Yet, Vorontsov's pragmatism was a stark reminder of their reality. Dmitry Rostinov, however, was not one for retreat. His loyalty to Russia, and to the ideal of a more just and efficient military, burned fiercely. He saw Paul's impending reign as a disaster for the army, a return to brutal but ineffective formalism. We cannot simply surrender the field, Anya, he argued during one of their increasingly urgent and secret meetings, held now in the shadowed corners of the vast Peter and Paul fortress. Where Rostinov's regimental duties sometimes took him, there are still good officers, men who care for their soldiers, who believe in merit. If we scatter, their voices will be silenced entirely. Anya was torn. Vorontsov's caution appealed to her. Intellect, her instinct for survival. Rostinov's defiance resonated with her own deeply buried idealism, the spirit that had penned the Rus resurgent. The crisis came. As it often does, with brutal swiftness, Catherine the Great suffered a massive stroke. For days, she lay unconscious, the empire suspended in a limbo of rumor and fear. Paul effectively seized control. His orders already issuing from Gachina, his grim out-of-town palace. The faces of his favorites were suddenly everywhere in St. Petersburg, their arrogance palpable. Vorontsov was immediately placed under house arrest. Anya, receiving a coded warning from one of his loyal servants, knew her time was limited. Rostinov appeared at her modest rooms near the library, his face grim, his uniform stripped of any unnecessary ornament, a sign of the new austerity. You must leave St. Petersburg, Anya, he said, his voice urgent. Tonight. I have arranged a carriage, papers. It will take you towards Novgorod, then further if necessary. Use Vorontsov's contacts. And you, Dmitri, she asked, her heart constricting. My place is here, he said, his jaw set. There are things that must be done. Oaths that must be kept, even if the man who will receive them is unworthy. He looked at her then, a depth of emotion in his eyes that he had always kept hidden. You have done more for Russia with your mind and your courage than most of these preening popinjays will do in a lifetime. Do not let them extinguish that spark. Go live. And perhaps, one day. He did not finish the sentence. He pressed a heavy purse into her hand, and a small, plain pistol. For protection. The roads are not safe. He then took her hand, not as a courtier, but as a soldier, a comrade. Be well, Anna Petrovna. And then he was gone, disappearing into the St. Petersburg night as quickly as he had come. Anya moved as if in a dream. She packed a small satchel, Vorontsov's ivory box, a few essential documents, the plainest dress she owned. The grand schemes, the carefully crafted memoranda, the hopes for an enlightened Russia, they all seemed to crumble into dust. All that remained was the primal instinct for survival. The journey was a blur of fear and frozen landscapes. The papers Rostinov had provided were surprisingly effective. The carriage nondescript. She avoided major towns, relying on Vorontsov's letters to find shelter with obscure country gentry or scholarly recluses who owed the old counselor past favors. News from St. Petersburg trickled in, distorted and delayed. Catherine was dead. Paul was Tsar. Purges had begun. Vorontsov was formally exiled to his estates, his health failing. Of Rostinov, there was no word. Anya found refuge in a small, isolated monastery library near the ancient city of Pskov, recommended by one of Vorontsov's contacts, an elderly monk who had once been a renowned historian. Here, surrounded by chronicles even older than those in the Imperial Library, Anya had time to reflect, to grieve for her lost hopes, for her endangered friends. The revolutionary fire that had burned so brightly seemed reduced to a flicker. She thought of Catherine, the German princess who had seized a throne, who had corresponded with Voltaire and expanded an empire, yet whose legacy was now being systematically dismantled by her own son. What had it all been for, the reforms shelved, the Enlightenment a tarnished veneer, the serfs still in bondage? Yet, as weeks turned into months, something began to stir within Anya again. The words of the precepts of Lumine, of Montesquieu, of her own youthful pamphlets, still held their power. Paul's reign, by all accounts, was proving as harsh and arbitrary as feared. The discontent, though suppressed, would surely smolder. One evening, reading a newly acquired, heavily censored gazette from St. Petersburg, she saw a small, almost hidden notice. Major Dmitry Rostinov of the Preobrazhensky regiment had been reassigned to a remote garrison on the Siberian frontier for insubordination and expressing views contrary to good military order. Siberia. A living death for many. But he was alive. And if he was alive, then the spark was not entirely extinguished. Anya looked at Vorontsov's ivory box of contacts. Vienna. Berlin. These were centers of thought, of change, of intellectual ferment. Perhaps her work was not done in Russia, not yet. Perhaps the path to a Rus resurgent was longer, more circuitous than she had ever imagined. Perhaps it involved gathering knowledge, forging new alliances, not within the suffocating confines of Paul's court, but from without. The scar above her eye, which had been a dull ache for so long, seemed to tingle with a renewed, if cautious, resolve. The game was not over. It had merely changed arenas. She was no longer Anna Valeriana, the Smolny scholar or Vorontsov's protégé. She was someone else now, forged in the fires of St. Petersburg intrigue and tempered by loss and exile. She was a keeper of a dangerous idea, that Russia could be, must be, more than what it was. And with that thought, she began to plan, not for a return to favor, but for a different kind of resurgence, one that might take a lifetime, but one she would not abandon. The Empress was dead, but the dream of an enlightened Russia, however battered, lived on within her. Life in the Pskov monastery was a stark contrast to the gilded cage of Smolny or the charged atmosphere of St. Petersburg salons. Here, the rhythms were dictated by prayer, by the seasons, by the slow turning of ancient pages. Anya, known to the handful of monks only as Anna Petrovna, a scholar seeking quiet for her research, found a strange solace in the anonymity and the silence. It was a silence that allowed her own thoughts, long drowned out by the cacophony of court politics, to surface. She spent her days in the monastery's surprisingly rich library, translating obscure Byzantine texts, comparing early Russian legal codes, tracing the fragile threads of reformist thought that had occasionally surfaced throughout Russia's turbulent history. She was not merely passing time, she was re-arming herself, deepening her understanding, preparing for a future she could not yet discern. Vorontsov's ivory box of contacts lay hidden, a promise of a world beyond these quiet walls, but she knew she was not yet ready for it. News of Tsar Paul's reign continued to filter through, each dispatch confirming the worst fears. He was systematically undoing his mother's legacy, not just in grand policy but in petty, symbolic ways. He exhumed Peter III's remains and reburied them with full honors beside Catherine, a grotesque posthumous reconciliation. He replaced Catherine's appointees with his own Gachina cronies, men known for their harshness and narrow-mindedness. The vibrant intellectual and artistic life Catherine had fostered withered under a pall of suspicion and censorship. Even the style of dress was dictated, with French fashions banned and Prussian-style military uniforms becoming ubiquitous. Anya read these accounts with a mixture of anger and a cold, analytical detachment. This was autocracy in its rawest form, unsoftened by Catherine's intellectual pretensions or her pragmatic need to cultivate a broader base of support. Paul ruled by fear and by decree. And the empire, after decades of Catherine's more complex, if often contradictory, stewardship, seemed to be regressing. One evening, Father Anastasius, the elderly monk who was the monastery's librarian and Anya's quiet protector, found her staring out at the snow-covered fields, a look of profound desolation on her face. He was a man of few words but deep wisdom. "The winter is harsh this year, my daughter," he said, his voice gentle. "But even the longest winter eventually yields to spring." Anya turned, a bitter smile on her lips. "Some winters, father, last a lifetime. Or an entire reign." "Perhaps," Anastasius conceded. "But the seeds beneath the snow do not die. They wait. They gather strength." He looked at her intently. "Your work here, Anna Petrovna. It is not just the study of dead languages and forgotten laws, is it?" Anya met his gaze. There was no point in dissembling with this man. "No, father. It is the study of how a nation loses its way. And how, perhaps, it might find it again." Anastasius nodded slowly. "Ideas are resilient things. More resilient than empires. Sometimes. Or Tsars." He paused. "A traveler passed through last week, a merchant from Riga. He spoke of unrest in the Baltic provinces, of new taxes and conscription orders from St. Petersburg that are ill-received. He also mentioned that Major Rostanov's Siberian garrison is near Tobolsk, a cold place, but not entirely cut off from the world, for one who knows how to listen." Anya's heart quickened. Tobolsk. It was a name, a location, a fragile thread of connection. The old monk, in his quiet way, was offering her not just solace, but intelligence. He was part of a network far older and more resilient than any court faction, the network of shared knowledge, of quiet dissent, of enduring hope. Emboldened, Anya began to cautiously use one of Vorontsov's contacts, a Lutheran pastor in Riga who had corresponded with Vorontsov on matters of theology and philosophy. Her first letter was circumspect, a scholarly inquiry about Baltic legal traditions. But within its carefully phrased questions, she embedded a request for news. For any reliable accounts of the mood in the western provinces, for any word that might filter through from the Siberian routes. The pastor's reply, months later, was equally cautious, but it contained what she sought. It spoke of growing discontent not just among the peasantry, but among the merchants and even some of the non-Russian nobility in the Baltic lands, who felt their traditional privileges being eroded by Paul's centralizing, Russifying policies. And it included a seemingly innocuous passage about the difficulties of travel in Siberia, mentioning that even official dispatches from garrisons like Tobolsk were often delayed or mislaid by inefficient local officials, unless one had a reliable private courier. Anya understood. A channel could be opened, if one had the means and the courage. She began to sell some of the few remaining pieces of jewelry she had brought from St. Petersburg, converting them into cash through a discreet agent of the Pskov merchants who occasionally visited the monastery. It was a slow, painstaking process. With the funds, she paid for small comforts for Father Anastasius and the other monks, earning their quiet gratitude and deepening their trust. And she began to cultivate her correspondence with the Riga pastor, slowly building a relationship of mutual intellectual respect. One day, nearly 2 years into her exile, a letter arrived from the pastor containing a small, folded piece of rough paper, clearly not of his own hand. On it, in a cramped, barely legible script that Anya recognized with a jolt that went straight to her core, were 3 words: "Spark endures." Tsar Dmitry Rostinov. He was alive, and he had found a way to reach her. The wave of emotion that washed over Anya was overwhelming: relief, joy, a resurgence of the fierce determination she thought had been buried under layers of despair. The spark endured. It was enough. She knew then that her time in the monastery was drawing to a close. Pskov had been a refuge, a place to heal and regroup. But it was not the place from which she could act. Vorontsov's ivory box beckoned. Vienna, Berlin. These were cities where ideas were still debated, where exiles from many lands gathered, where the currents of European politics flowed strong. She confided in Father Anastasius. "I must leave, Father. There is work to be done elsewhere." The old monk looked at her, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. "I knew this day would come, Anna Petrovna. The world has need of minds like yours, even if it often tries to silence them." He gave her his blessing, a small wooden cross, and a letter of introduction to a scholarly society in Leipzig, known for its quiet but persistent critique of autocratic regimes. "Leipzig is a city of books and debate," he said. "And it is on the road to other places. May your path be guided by wisdom, and may your spark, too, endure." Anya left the Pskov monastery as quietly as she had arrived, no longer just Anna Valeriana, the scholar, but a woman with a renewed, if far more sober, purpose. She was armed with knowledge, with a few precious contacts, and with 3 words from a frozen wasteland that had rekindled a dying flame. Her destination was uncertain, her resources meager, the forces arrayed against her formidable. But the Rus resurgent, she now understood, was not just a pamphlet or a dream. It was a long, arduous journey, and she was, once again, ready to take the next step. The education of Catherine the Great's Russia had been a complex, contradictory affair. The education of Paul's Russia would be a battle fought in the shadows, a battle for its very soul. And Anya, in her own small way, intended to be one of its most dedicated, if unseen, warriors. The journey from Pskov to Leipzig was an education in itself. Anya traveled under an assumed name, her meager funds carefully hoarded, her senses alive to the realities of a continent teetering on the brink of monumental change. The French Revolution, no longer a distant rumor, was a palpable force. Its shockwaves felt even in the sleepy German principalities and the tightly controlled Prussian territories she traversed. She heard whispers of peasant uprisings inspired by French ideals. Of nervous monarchs tightening their grip, of émigrés fleeing terror and spreading tales of radical new philosophies. Leipzig, when she finally reached it, was a bustling hub of trade and, more importantly for Anya, a city teeming with printing presses, universities, and coffee houses where forbidden books were discreetly exchanged and radical ideas debated in hushed tones. Father Anastasius's letter of introduction gained her entry into a small, scholarly circle, the Collegium Philadelphium, a group of academics, exiled intellectuals, and liberal-minded thinkers who shared a common interest in political philosophy and a cautious hope for reform across Europe. Here, Anya found not the glittering salons of St. Petersburg, but a more earnest, if no less intense, intellectual environment. She shed her Russian provincialism, engaging in debates on Locke, on the nascent ideas of Kant, on the practical applications of Rousseau's social contract. Her insights into the workings of a vast autocracy like Russia, her first-hand experience of its attempts at enlightened rule and its subsequent slide into reaction, were prized by the Collegium. She was no longer just Anna Petrovna, the quiet scholar. She became Anya Valeriana, a keen analyst of the Russian enigma. She supported herself by undertaking translations of Russian historical documents for German scholars and by discreetly tutoring the children of sympathetic merchants in French and Russian. It was a precarious existence. But it afforded her intellectual freedom and access to a flow of information she could only have dreamed of in Pskov. Through the Collegium's network, and with painstaking effort, she re-established a fragile line of communication with Dmitry Rostonov. Messages, heavily coded and routed through a complex chain of merchants and sympathetic academics, took months to travel to Tobolsk and back. But they did travel. Rostonov's brief note spoke of the harsh conditions, of Paul's iron discipline slowly strangling the initiative out of the army, but also of a corps of officers who remembered Catherine's era, who still believed in a more modern, efficient military, and who chafed under the new regime. The frost is deep. One message read, but even permafrost can be thawed by a persistent sun, or by fire from below. Anya also began to use Vorontsov's contacts in Vienna and Berlin. She initiated correspondence with several of them, not seeking aid, but offering her own analyses of Russian affairs, her insights into the complex dynamics of Paul's court. She was building a reputation, albeit under a pen name, as a knowledgeable observer of the Colossus to the east. She knew that if she were ever to influence events in Russia again, she would need allies, information, and a platform beyond Russia's borders. One of Vorontsov's most intriguing Viennese contacts was a Baron von Steinfeld, a diplomat with a keen interest in Eastern European affairs and a reputation for unconventional thinking. Anya's letters, filled with nuanced observations on Paul's insecurities and the potential fault lines within his regime, impressed him. He began to correspond with her more regularly, posing specific questions, seeking her opinion on the likely Russian response to various European crises. It was through von Steinfeld that Anya learned of growing concern in certain European courts about Tsar Paul's erratic foreign policy. His sudden shifts in alliance, his grandiose pronouncements, and his increasingly unpredictable behavior were making him a dangerously unreliable factor in the delicate balance of European power. Even those monarchs who initially welcomed his reactionary stance against French revolutionary ideals were beginning to see him as a liability. There are those in Vienna, and indeed in Berlin and London, von Steinfeld wrote in a particularly candid letter, who believed that a more stable and predictable leadership in St. Petersburg would be beneficial to all. The current Tsar's passions, shall we say, make long-term planning a challenging endeavor. Anya saw an opening, a dangerous, audacious one. Could the internal discontent within Russia, the frustrations of men like Rostonov and his circle, find common cause, however temporary or unacknowledged, with the external concerns of European powers wary of Paul's instability, she began to subtly shape her analyses for von Steinfeld, highlighting not just Paul's erratic foreign policy, but the internal weaknesses of his regime, the alienation of the Catharinian nobility, the disaffection within the military, the economic stagnation caused by his arbitrary decrees. She painted a picture of an empire outwardly strong but inwardly brittle, ruled by a Tsar whose obsessions were creating deep resentments. She never advocated for direct intervention, but she laid out the conditions under which internal change might become possible. Simultaneously, her messages to Rostinov became more focused. She spoke less of abstract ideals and more of practicalities, the importance of identifying and cultivating reliable officers, of creating secure communication networks within the army, of documenting Paul's damaging policies and their impact on military readiness. She was, from afar, trying to nurture the fire from below. He had spoken of. This was a new kind of warfare for Anya, war of information, of subtle influence, of connecting disparate threads of discontent. It was a far cry from drafting reform proposals for Vorontsov or unearthing Bezborodko's corruptions. This was playing on a much larger, more dangerous chessboard, where the pieces were armies and empires, and the stakes were the fate of nations. Years passed in this manner. Anya lived frugally, her life a disciplined routine of research, writing, correspondence, and quiet networking. The revolutionary fervor that had first driven her had matured into a steely, patient resolve. She was no longer the naive idealist of Smolny, nor the anxious operative of Vorontsov's circle. She was becoming a political thinker in her own right, her understanding of power deepened by exile and adversity. Then came the news that electrified the émigré circles and sent ripples of shock through the European courts. Tsar Paul I of Russia had been assassinated in a palace coup. Killed in his own chambers by a group of disgruntled officers and courtiers. Anya received the news from Baron von Steinfeld, a terse, urgent dispatch. The bear has a new master. Alexander. Young, said to be impressionable. Educated by a Swiss Republican. Grandson of your great Catherine. The game changes once more. Alexander. Catherine's favored grandson, the boy she had hoped might inherit her throne and her enlightened ideals. Bypassing the problematic Paul. Anya remembered the whispers from her time in St. Petersburg, the hopes that had been pinned on this young prince. But she also knew that Alexander had been raised in the shadow of Paul's tyranny, that he was implicated, at least by association, in his father's murder. What kind of Tsar would he be, a true reformer, or merely a more palatable face for the same autocratic system? Her first instinct was a surge of elation. Paul, the tyrant, was gone. Rostinov, if he had survived these intervening years, might be freed from Siberia. Vorontsov, if his health held, might be recalled from his internal exile. But this was quickly followed by a wave of caution. Palace coups were notoriously bloody and unpredictable affairs. The new Tsar, Alexander, would be surrounded by those who had put him on the throne, men with their own agendas, their own scores to settle. Rostinov's next message, arriving weeks later, was cautiously optimistic. The ice has broken. New currents flow. Tobolsk is behind me. I am summoned to St. Petersburg. Your spark helped keep the flame alive in the frost. What now, Anya Valeriana, for Rus resurgent, what now? The question echoed in Anya's small Leipzig room. The path back to Russia was suddenly, terrifyingly, open. But what Russia would she find? And what role, if any, could she, an exile, a woman whose name was likely on dusty lists of suspected subversives, play in its future? The ivory box of Vorontsov's contacts felt heavier than ever. The long game she had been playing from afar was about to enter a new, far more dangerous, phase. The summons from Dmitry Rostinov was not an invitation to return to a position of influence. nor a promise of safety. It was a stark question, a challenge. St. Petersburg, in the immediate aftermath of Paul's assassination and Alexander's ascension in the spring of 1801, was a city of volatile hope and profound uncertainty. The conspirators who had put Alexander on the throne, a mixed group of Catharinian Old Guard, ambitious military officers, and English-influenced liberals, were jostling for power. Each with their own vision for Russia's future, or at least for their own advancement. Anya, after much soul-searching and a lengthy, coded correspondence with Rostinov, who was indeed back in St. Petersburg, reinstated in the Preobrazhensky regiment and, to her surprise, appointed to a junior role on a new, vaguely defined committee for public safety, decided to take the immense risk. She would return to Russia. Not as Anna Valeriana, the former library assistant, but under a new identity, one carefully constructed with the help of Baron von Steinfeld and her Leipzig contacts. She would be Madame Annette Duval, a Swiss widow of modest means. A scholar of comparative jurisprudence with a particular interest in Russian legal history. The journey was fraught with anxiety. Even with expertly forged papers and von Steinfeld's discreet influence smoothing her passage through Prussian and Polish territories, every border crossing, every inquisitive official, was a potential disaster. But the pull of Russia, of the possibility, however slim, of influencing the course of this new reign, was too strong to resist. St. Petersburg was a city transformed, yet eerily the same. The grim, militaristic atmosphere of Paul's rule had lifted, replaced by a palpable sense of relief and a tentative, almost fearful, optimism. Salons buzzed with talk of reform, of a new era of enlightenment. Young Tsar Alexander himself was a figure of fascination, handsome, charming, articulate in his pronouncements of wanting the best for his people, yet with an air of melancholy and an enigmatic reserve that made him difficult to read. He spoke of his grandmother, Catherine, with reverence, and of his desire to fulfill her true intentions. Anya, as Madame Duval, established herself quietly in a modest apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, a district known for its academic institutions and foreign residents. Her first meeting with Rostinov was in a crowded, noisy tavern near the port, a place where their conversation would be lost in the general hubbub. Dmitri had changed. The Siberian frost seemed to have etched new lines around his eyes, but the fire within them burned brighter, if more controlled. He was leaner, harder, his earlier impulsiveness tempered by a grim pragmatism. There was a new authority in his bearing. "It is good to see you, Anya," he said, his voice low, the use of her real name a testament to their bond. "Safer, perhaps, than I imagined. And you, Dmitri? St. Petersburg seems different. Different masters, different tunes," he said with a wry smile. "Alexander means well, I think. He genuinely desires reform. He has surrounded himself with a secret committee of his young friends, Czartoryski, Novoziltsev, Stroganov, all full of Western ideas. All eager to remake Russia overnight." "That sounds promising," Anya ventured. Rostinov's smile faded. "Promising, and dangerous. They are idealists, Anya, much like you were. They lack experience, they underestimate the resistance of the old guard, men who may have helped depose Paul but have no intention of seeing their own privileges diminished. And Alexander himself. He is a man of moods, of grand visions one day and deep doubts the next. He is torn between his liberal education and his autocratic inheritance." This was the new landscape Anya had to navigate. Her direct connections to the Catharinian era were liabilities. Vorontsov was still in internal exile. His health too fragile for a return to active politics, though Alexander had sent him a token message of goodwill. Her carefully built reputation in European scholarly circles as Anya Valeriana was something she had to keep hidden. As Madame Duval, she was an unknown, an outsider. But she had her intellect, her knowledge, and Rostinov. Dmitri, through his position on the nebulous Committee for Public Safety, a body tasked more with monitoring public opinion and identifying potential threats to the new regime than with actual reform, had access to information and to some of the younger, more progressive officials within Alexander's circle. Anya, as Madame Duval, began to discreetly offer her services as a translator and researcher, specializing in European legal systems. Her work was meticulous, her analyses insightful. Rostinov subtly steered small but complex research tasks away from some of Alexander's young friends who were struggling to translate their abstract ideals into practical legislative proposals. One such figure was Count Pavel Stroganov, an ardent Anglophile, full of youthful enthusiasm but often lacking in detailed knowledge. Rostinov arranged an accidental meeting. Anya, as the knowledgeable Swiss scholar, impressed Stroganov with her quiet command of comparative law and her insightful questions about the challenges of implementing reforms in a vast, diverse empire like Russia. She did not offer grand pronouncements or radical solutions. Instead, she focused on practicalities, on the lessons of history, on the need for careful groundwork. She spoke of Catherine's Nakaz, not as a failed dream, but as a foundational text whose principles, if adapted to new realities, might still offer guidance. She was, in essence, doing what she had always done, using her intellect to shape the debate. To nudge events, but this time from an even more marginalized position, with even greater risks. Her past as the author of the Rus Resurgent was a deeply buried secret. If it were ever discovered, it could destroy her. The conservative factions were still powerful, and any hint of radicalism, especially from a foreigner, would be pounced upon. Even Alexander's liberals were wary of anything that smacked of Jacobinism. Anya's greatest challenge was Tsar Alexander himself. He was, as Rostinov had said, an enigma. He could speak eloquently of liberty and justice in his private circle, yet he was also acutely aware of his dependence on the nobility and the military. He was haunted by his father's murder, fearful of a similar fate. He approved commissions for reform, then hesitated to implement their findings if they met with significant opposition. Anya saw in him a reflection of Catherine's own paradox, but without Catherine's steely resolve or her decades of experience in wielding power. Alexander had the idealism, but did he have the will, the ruthlessness, to see it through? Through Stroganov, and occasionally through carefully worded memoranda passed via Rostinov, Anya began to feed her ideas into the discussions of the secret committee. She argued for gradualism, for focusing on achievable reforms, improving education, clarifying legal codes, reforming provincial administration. She stressed the importance of building a competent, meritocratic bureaucracy, a theme that resonated with Alexander's own frustrations with the existing system. It was a slow, painstaking process, a war of attrition fought with footnotes and precedents rather than pamphlets and pronouncements. She was a ghost in the machine of Alexander's early reform efforts, her influence invisible to all but a handful. Celine Kirsanova, now a prominent figure in St. Petersburg's commercial society, occasionally crossed paths with Madame Duval. Celine's sharp eyes missed little, and Anya suspected she harbored suspicions about the quiet Swiss scholar's true identity. But Celine, ever the pragmatist, said nothing. A knowledgeable, discreet woman like Madame Duval could be useful, and Celine always valued utility. Perhaps she even felt a grudging admiration for Anya's resilience. The greatest test of Alexander's resolve, and Anya's indirect influence, came with the question of serfdom. It was the bedrock of the old order, the issue that Catherine had ultimately shied away from tackling. Alexander's young friends were eager for emancipation. The nobility was fiercely opposed. Anya, through Rostinov, provided Stroganov with detailed historical analyses of peasant reforms in other European countries, highlighting both successes and failures. She proposed not immediate, wholesale emancipation, which she knew was politically impossible, but a series of gradual measures, limiting the obligations of serfs, granting them the right to own property, establishing clear legal protections against the worst abuses of landowners. Her proposals were a carefully calibrated compromise, designed to be just progressive enough to offer hope, yet conservative enough not to trigger an immediate aristocratic revolt. The Decree on Free Agriculturalists of 1803, when it was finally issued, was a pale shadow of even Anya's cautious proposals. It allowed landowners to voluntarily free their serfs. But it imposed no obligations and offered few incentives. It was a typical Alexandrine compromise, a gesture towards reform that ultimately changed little. Anya felt a familiar wave of disappointment, but not despair. This was the reality of Russia. Change, if it came at all, would be incremental, hard-won, and always at risk of reversal. "It is a beginning, Anya," Rostinov said, sensing her mood. "A small crack in a very large wall. Your work provided the language, the framework, even for this small step. Without it, there might have been nothing but more empty promises." He was right. Her role was not to be the empress, the Tsar, the grand architect of reform. Her role was to be the intellectual engine, the quiet strategist, the keeper of the flame of reasoned hope in a land that often seemed determined to extinguish it. She was playing the long game, a game that might outlast her own life. The legacy of Catherine the Great was not just in her territorial expansions or her grand palaces, but in the very idea she had, however imperfectly, championed. That Russia could be guided by more than just brute force and blind tradition. Anya Valeriana, now Madame Annette Duval, had inherited that dangerous, essential task. And as Tsar Alexander I embarked on his own complex and contradictory reign, she would be there, in the shadows, her intellect a quiet but persistent force, working for a Russia that was still more dream than reality. The scar above her eye, a reminder of her own youthful stumbles and her enduring resolve, no longer throbbed with frustration, but with a steady, patient pulse. The resurgence would be slow. But it would continue. The early years of Alexander's reign unfolded in a pattern that became frustratingly familiar to Anya. Bursts of reformist zeal followed by periods of hesitation, compromise, and often, quiet retreat in the face of entrenched opposition. The young friends of the secret committee, full of abstract ideals, found themselves bogged down in the morass of Russian bureaucracy and the intractable resistance of the landowning class. Anya, through her discreet channels, continued to supply them with research, historical precedents, and drafts of potential legislation, but she saw her carefully constructed arguments diluted, her proposals whittled down to near impotence. "It is like trying to sculpt water," she confided to Rostinov during one of their infrequent, carefully arranged meetings. They stood on the embankment of the Neva. The late summer sun glinting on the water, the grandeur of St. Petersburg a deceptive facade over the deep currents of inertia. One moment you think you have given it shape, the next it has slipped through your fingers. Rostinov, now a colonel and a trusted, if not central, figure in Alexander's military establishment, nodded grimly. "The Tsar has a good heart, Anya, and a fine mind when he chooses to use it. But he is a man pulled in too many directions. He fears the fate of his father if he moves too boldly against the nobility. He is intoxicated by the idea of being Europe's arbiter, its peacemaker, and these grand foreign designs often overshadow the tedious work of internal reform." Indeed, Napoleon Bonaparte was casting an ever longer shadow over Europe, and Alexander, seeing himself as a key player on this continental stage, was increasingly preoccupied with diplomacy and the shifting alliances of the great powers. The domestic agenda, while not entirely abandoned, took a back seat. Anya, as Madame Duval, found her expertise in comparative European law increasingly sought after, not for internal Russian reform, but for understanding treaties, alliances, and the legal underpinnings of international relations. It was not the work she had envisioned, but it kept her close to the fringes of power. Her analyses valued for their clarity and objectivity. She became a quiet, almost invisible, resource for figures like Adam Czartoryski, Alexander's Polish friend and foreign minister, a man who appreciated her nuanced understanding of the European political landscape. This shift in focus, however, also brought new dangers. As Russia became more entangled in the Napoleonic Wars, first as a reluctant ally of France, then as a key member of the coalitions against it, the atmosphere in St. Petersburg grew more nationalistic, more suspicious of foreign influences. Anya's Swiss identity, once a useful cover, now occasionally drew wary glances. Her French name, Duval, was a minor liability. It was Céline Kirsanova, now a wealthy and influential hostess whose salon attracted a diverse mix of diplomats, military officers, and financiers, who offered Anya a subtle warning. "Be careful, Annette," she said one evening, her voice a low murmur amidst the chatter and clinking glasses. "The mood is changing. Patriotism is the new currency, and those with less than purely Russian pedigrees are being watched. Even our good Tsar, for all his European education, must now play the part of the staunch Russian defender." Anya understood. The window for liberal reform, already narrow, was closing fast. The focus was shifting to national survival, to the existential threat posed by Napoleon's seemingly invincible armies. The year 1812 was a turning point. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the burning of Moscow, the brutal winter retreat of the Grande Army, these events seared themselves into the Russian psyche. Anya, watching from St. Petersburg, felt the same surge of patriotic fervor as everyone else, yet her analytical mind also saw the horrific cost, the devastation, the way the war was further entrenching autocratic power under the guise of national unity. Rostinov was in the thick of the fighting, distinguishing himself in several key battles, his reports from the front stark and unvarnished. His letters to Anya, when they got through, were no longer about political theory but about the grim realities of war, the courage of the common soldier, the appalling losses. He wrote of a new generation of young officers, forged in the crucible of 1812, men who had seen the flaws of the system firsthand, who had fought alongside peasant soldiers and witnessed their resilience. These men, he hinted, would not be content to return to the old ways. When the war finally ended, with Napoleon defeated and Alexander hailed as the savior of Europe, Russia was triumphant, but also exhausted and deeply scarred. The Tsar returned to St. Petersburg a changed man, more mystical, more conservative, his earlier liberal inclinations seemingly burned away by the fires of war. The young friends of the secret committee were largely sidelined, their reformist ideas now viewed as naive, even dangerous. Men like Count Arakcheyev, a brutal reactionary and proponent of military settlements, gained ascendancy. For Anya, this was a bleak period. The hopes of Alexander's early reign seemed to have turned to ash. Vorontsov had passed away peacefully on his estate. His correspondence with Anya, her last link to the Catherinian era's complex intellectual heritage. Rostinov, though a decorated war hero, found himself increasingly out of favor with Arakcheyev's faction, his calls for military modernization and better treatment of soldiers dismissed as coddling and insubordination. Yet, beneath the surface of reactionary triumphalism, something new was stirring. The officers Rostinov had written about, the veterans of 1812, returned to Russia with new ideas. Having seen Europe, having witnessed societies with different laws, different freedoms, secret societies began to form, discussing constitutions, republics, the abolition of serfdom. These were not the cautious reformers of Alexander's youth. These were more radical, more impatient men. Rostanov, while not directly part of these secret societies, his loyalty to the army, if not always to its current leadership, was too ingrained, was aware of them. He shared their frustrations, if not always their methods. He occasionally met with some of their more moderate members, men he had served with, trying to steer them away from reckless action, urging patience, though his own was wearing thin. Anya, as Madame Duval, became a discreet confidant for Rostanov. Her quiet apartment was one of the few places he could speak freely of his concerns, of the dangerous currents running beneath the placid surface of Alexander's later reign. She listened, analyzed, offered historical parallels, warned against rashness. Her role had shifted again, from an active, if indirect, shaper of policy, to a wise counselor, a keeper of perspective in a time of growing extremism. "They talk of striking at the root, Anya," Rostanov said one night, his face etched with worry. "They speak of regicide, of a military coup to force a constitution. They are brave, patriotic men, but they are playing with fire, a fire that could consume all of Russia." "And what do you counsel them, Dmitri?" Anya asked. "I tell them what you have always told me, that change without foundation is chaos. That ideas must be planted, nurtured, not imposed by the sword overnight." He looked at her, a deep weariness in his eyes. "But they have seen too much, suffered too much. Their patience is gone. And perhaps mine is too." Anya understood his despair. The dream of an enlightened, reformed Russia. The dream that had animated Catherine in her best moments, that had flickered in Alexander's youth, that had driven Anya herself through years of exile and quiet struggle, seemed further away than ever. The victory over Napoleon had, paradoxically, strengthened the chains of autocracy at home. Yet, she could not entirely abandon hope. The very existence of these secret societies, the ferment of ideas among the returning officers, was proof that the spark, however suppressed, endured. Catherine's complex legacy was not just in her territorial gains or her correspondence with philosophers, but in the intellectual curiosity she had, for a time, unleashed. Even Paul's tyranny and Alexander's later conservatism could not entirely extinguish it. Her own work continued, quieter now, more focused. She began to write again, not political treatises, but a meticulously researched history of Russian legal and institutional development, a work that subtly highlighted the recurring attempts at reform, the moments of progress, the lessons of past failures. It was a scholarly work, under her academic Swiss identity, but it was also her testament, her way of keeping the historical memory alive, of providing a foundation for future reformers, whenever and however they might emerge. One day, Rostanov brought her a young officer, Captain Ivan Muravyov, a veteran of Borodino, his face still boyish but his eyes holding the haunted look of one who had seen too much. He was connected to one of the more moderate secret societies. He had read some of Madame Duval's published monographs on European legal systems and sought her out, through Rostanov, for her perspective. As Anya spoke with him, explaining the slow, difficult path of legal reform in other nations, the need for public education, for a change in societal mindset, not just a change in rulers, she saw a flicker of understanding, of the dawning realization that revolution was more than just a single, dramatic act. Perhaps this was her true role now, she thought. Not to advise Tsars or draft grand legislation, but to educate, to mentor, to plant the seeds of reasoned change in the minds of a new generation, a generation that might, in time, succeed where hers had been frustrated. Tsar Alexander died unexpectedly in 1825. Far from the capital, leaving behind a disputed succession and an empire teetering on the brink. The secret societies saw their moment. The Decembrist revolt, an attempt by a small group of officers to force a constitution, erupted in Senate Square in St. Petersburg. Rostanov, caught between his loyalty to the army and his sympathy for the reformers' ideals though not their methods, played a tragic role in trying to mediate, to prevent bloodshed. The revolt was brutally crushed. The leaders were arrested, exiled to Siberia, some executed. A new Tsar, Nicholas I, Alexander's younger brother, a man of iron will and unyielding autocratic principles, ascended the throne. The winter that Vorontsov had warned of had truly arrived, harsher and longer than any could have imagined. Anya watched these events unfold from her quiet apartment, her heart heavy. Many of the young men she had known, or known of, including Captain Muravyov, were implicated. Rostanov, though not directly involved in the revolt, was tainted by association, his career finished, his own future uncertain. Yet, even in this moment of profound darkness, as Nicholas I began his 30-year reign of reaction and repression, Anya Valeriana did not entirely despair. The Decembrists had failed, but their sacrifice, their ideas, would become a legend, a new chapter in Russia's long, painful struggle for enlightenment. Her scholarly work, her quiet efforts to preserve knowledge and foster critical thought, felt more urgent than ever. She was an old woman now, her hair streaked with gray, the scar above her eye a faint silver line. St. Petersburg was a city of ghosts, of lost hopes and broken dreams. But it was also a city of resilient memory. And Anya, the girl from Smolny who had dared to dream of a Rus resurgent, had become one of its most steadfast, if unacknowledged, keepers. The seeds she had planted, the ideas she had nurtured, might lie dormant for a long time beneath the frozen soil of Nicholas's Russia. But seeds, as Father Anastasius had told her long ago, do not die. They wait. They gather strength. And spring, however delayed, eventually comes. Her life had been a testament to that quiet, enduring faith. The legacy of Catherine, in its most profound sense, was not in Tsars or empires, but in that unquenchable human striving for a more reasoned, a more just world. And Anya had played her part. The reign of Nicholas I settled over Russia like a vast, suffocating shroud. It was an era of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, a deliberate rejection of the westernizing influences that had flickered, however inconsistently, under Catherine and in the early years of Alexander. The third section, Nicholas's secret police, became an omnipresent force, its spies and informers weaving a web of fear that stifled dissent and drove intellectual life into the deepest shadows. Anya, now well into her later years, lived a life of extreme caution. Madame Annette Duval, the quiet Swiss scholar, was a persona she inhabited with meticulous care. Her academic publications on comparative jurisprudence were deliberately abstruse. Her public utterances confined to the driest of scholarly topics. Yet, in the privacy of her small apartment, the flame of her intellect, and her commitment to a different Russia, still burned. Dmitry Rostanov had, surprisingly, been spared the worst of the Decembrist purges. His heroic war record, his known if grudging loyalty to the military hierarchy, and perhaps the intervention of some still influential Catherinian veterans who remembered his competence, had saved him from Siberia or execution. He was, however, forcibly retired from the army, his career in ruins, and placed under discreet but constant surveillance. He lived a quiet, embittered life on a small, heavily mortgaged estate near Tver, a shadow of the dynamic officer he once was. Their communication became even more perilous, reduced to occasional, heavily veiled messages exchanged through trusted intermediaries, a traveling bookseller, a sympathetic country doctor. Rostanov wrote of the stagnation, the mind-numbing conformity demanded by Nicholas's regime, the frustration of seeing Russia fall further behind a rapidly industrializing Europe. "We are a barracks, Anya," one letter lamented, "not an empire. Discipline is mistaken for strength, silence for loyalty. Anya, in turn, shared with him what glimmers of intellectual life she could find, news of philosophical debates in German universities carefully omitting anything too radical, summaries of new historical works that subtly challenged the official narrative. She was trying to keep a window open for him, a connection to the world of ideas from which he was now largely cut off. Her own work became her sole consolation and her quiet form of resistance. Her magnum opus, The History of Russian Legal and Institutional Development, grew slowly, page by painstaking page. It was a work of immense scholarship, tracing the evolution of Russian law from the Russkaya Pravda to the legislative efforts of Catherine and Alexander. On the surface, it was a neutral, academic study. But woven into its dense fabric were the recurring themes of reform attempted, reform thwarted, and the persistent, underlying currents of a yearning for justice and rational governance. She documented the failures as meticulously as the fleeting successes, letting the historical record itself serve as a critique of the present. She knew it was unlikely to be published in Nicholas's Russia. But she wrote it for the future. For a time when such ideas might once again be openly discussed. She thought of it as her final message in a bottle, cast into a vast and turbulent sea. Occasionally, very occasionally, a young student from the university, perhaps a grandson of one of Vorontsov's old associates or a young scholar who had stumbled upon Madame Duval's earlier, less controversial monographs, would seek her out. They came with hesitant questions, with a hunger for knowledge that had to be carefully concealed. Anya would speak to them, not of revolution or grand political schemes, but of history, of philosophy, of the importance of critical thought, of the long, slow work of building a just society from the foundations up. She was planting seeds, just as Father Anastasius and Vorontsov had once planted seeds in her. Celine Kirsanova, now a formidably wealthy dowager, still presided over one of St. Petersburg's most influential salons. Her pragmatism had served her well. She had navigated the transition to Nicholas's reign with her fortune and influence intact, her salon a place where even high-ranking officials of the new regime felt comfortable. She and Anya rarely met now, their worlds having diverged too greatly. But once, at a public lecture on Byzantine art, their eyes met across the crowded room. Celine gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect, for the quiet, unassuming scholar who had once been her unlikely ally. As Anya grew older, the physical world shrank to her small apartment, her books, her carefully tended window box of herbs that reminded her of the gardens at Smolny. But her intellectual world remained vast. She corresponded with a small circle of European scholars. Her letters carefully vetted by the ever-watchful third section, yet still managing to convey, between the lines, a sense of her undiminished critical faculties. One cold winter morning, a young, nervous-looking man appeared at her door. He was Ivan Muravyov, the former captain, his face now deeply lined, his youth long gone. He had served 15 hard years in Siberian exile for his peripheral involvement with the Decembrists and had only recently been allowed to return to European Russia, albeit stripped of his rank and rights, a forgiven but forever marked man. Rostinov, before his own recent death from a lung inflammation exacerbated by years of disillusionment, had given Muravyov her name, her address. Madame Duval, he asked, his voice hoarse. Colonel Rostinov. He spoke of you. He said you kept the faith when all others lost it. Anya invited him in, her old heart stirring with a mixture of sorrow and a strange, unexpected warmth. They spoke for hours. Muravyov told her of Siberia, of the Decembrists who had tried to create oases of intellectual life even in the frozen wastes, of their unbroken spirit. He spoke of Rostinov's last years, his quiet despair, but also his enduring belief in the men he had once led. Anya, in turn, spoke of her own long vigil. Of her scholarly work, of the small, almost invisible ways she had tried to keep the embers of reasoned thought alive. She showed him the manuscript of her history. Now nearly complete. Muravyov read through parts of it, his eyes, which had seen so much suffering, slowly lighting with understanding. This is not just a history, madam, he said finally, his voice filled with awe. This is a roadmap. A testament. He looked at her. May I have a copy made? There are others who need to read this. Young men, in the universities, in the junior ranks of the civil service, who are asking the same questions we once did, but who lack the knowledge, the perspective. Anya knew the risk. Circulating such a manuscript, even privately, in Nicholas's Russia was an act of profound courage. Or profound folly. But looking at Muravyov, at the hope rekindled in his weary eyes, she could not refuse. This was why she had written it. It is not finished, Captain, she said softly. A history of Russia's search for itself is never truly finished, but perhaps it can serve as a guide for those who continue the journey. In her final years, Anya Valeriana, known to the world as Annette Duval, found a quiet purpose in these clandestine encounters. She was a link to a past that the regime tried to erase, a quiet source of inspiration for a future that seemed impossibly distant. She never saw any grand reforms in her lifetime. Nicholas I ruled until his death, his iron system seemingly immutable. But the seeds had indeed been sown. The students who read her manuscript in secret, the young officers who remembered the tales of the Decembrists. The quiet scholars who continued to ask forbidden questions, they were the inheritors of a long, complex legacy, the legacy of Catherine's flawed enlightenment. Of Alexander's hesitant liberalism, of the Decembrists' tragic sacrifice, and of the quiet, persistent intellectual resistance of women like Anya herself. When Anya finally passed away, a woman of great age, in her small St. Petersburg apartment, few mourned the obscure Swiss scholar Madame Duval. Her true identity, her lifelong struggle, remained largely unknown. Her great historical work would only be published decades later. In a different Russia, a Russia slowly, painfully, beginning to grapple with the very questions she had dedicated her life to exploring. But perhaps, in the grand, intricate web of history that Vorontsov had once described, her thread, though seemingly small and hidden, had been essential. She had kept the spark alive through a long, dark winter. She had understood, as Catherine perhaps had in her most lucid moments, that true power lies not just in decrees and armies, but in the enduring strength of ideas, in the unyielding human desire for reason, for justice, for a better world. The Rus resurgent had not been a swift victory, but a generational struggle. And Anya Valeriana had been one of its most faithful, if unsung, soldiers. The scar above her eye, a silent witness to her journey, was finally at peace.